Well, hey, thanks for joining me. Today we're going to continue in Psalm chapter 22. We're going to do verses 11 through 21. Now, I've done verses 1 through 10 already in two previous devotional editions, so I would encourage you to go back to those videos and watch them, so that way you can get the context here. But basically what's going on is this is King David who's writing this after a time of just feeling abandoned by God, he's like, my God, why have you forsaken me? Enemies are surrounding David. He's in extreme anguish, and he just feels like he has no help. And this is why he says, do not be far from me. He's speaking to Yahweh God. He says, do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no one to help. Even those few, left who are still loyal to him, doesn't really matter. There's so many enemies that no one could really help him out except for Yahweh God. And he knows that in the past, Yahweh has always been there for him. But for some reason at this point, it feels like Yahweh is far from him. And he says that many bulls surround me, strong bulls of Bashan encircle me, roaring lions that tear their prey, open their mouths wide against me. He's talking about his enemies, his human enemies for sure, right? They're surrounding him. They're terrifying. They've got like a lot of strength and even a deadly intent. I mean, they're encircling him, wanting to kill him. The roaring lions, again, they're strong, but they've got a lot of power and really just a hatred of godliness. They're wanting to devour David and the rest of his people that are with him. Now, again, these are referring to human enemies. However, as I mentioned in my last sermon, when David mentions Bashan here, he is alluding to an unseen spiritual realm of things that are happening as well. Now, how do I know this? Well, I know this because bulls of Bashan are mentioned elsewhere in the Old Testament. They're mentioned as bulls of Bashan. They're also mentioned as cows of Bashan, and they can refer to rebellious spiritual beings. So in Ezekiel 39, verse 18, you see these terms for mighty men or princes of the earth. I mean, these are supernatural, rebellious spiritual being terms. So there's obviously the supernatural implications here. But even more than that, in Amos chapter 4, verse 1, we see cows of Bashan. And one commentator writes that it is quite possible that the cows of Bashan are the deities themselves in the forms of the idols. This possibly is strengthened by noticing their crimes. Well, okay, what are their crimes? Their crimes are oppressing the poor and crushing the needy. Again, this is Amos chapter 4. Now, the same Hebrew terms here for oppressing the poor and crushing the needy are also used in Psalm 82, where the corrupt spiritual beings are accused of the exact same crimes. That's Psalm 82, verses 3 to 4. So you see the link there. They're not just, they're for sure are human enemies, for sure. But oftentimes when evil seems to be rising up, and you see it clearly in the human enemies, oftentimes there are spiritual enemies behind that, kind of orchestrating it. Now, I can't help but think of C.S. Lewis and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, because we know this psalm ties directly to the crucifixion of Jesus, right? The New Testament authors give us that. So because we know that, I think of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I want to show you this scene, how Lewis really depicts, these bulls of Bashan and roaring lions, and even dogs surround David. We'll see dogs in this clip too. So here, check it out. So that scene was supposed to just be a picture of the death of Jesus on the cross. So Jesus wasn't just surrounded by his human enemies who put him on the cross. There was also a spiritual element too, which is what David's getting at here in Psalm 22. And the New Testament authors recognize that, and even a modern day scholar who is long deceased, actually, C.S. Lewis, recognized that and gave us a nice picture of that in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So if we continue on to verse 14, he says, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It has melted within me. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. All right, so David can no longer function as a human being. I mean, his bones, his heart, his strength, his tongue, all of those things that we normally, have, that normally work and function as a human being, all of those fail him. And not because of a serious disease, but because of just a traumatic response of being hated. Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever, known that someone just hated you? And do you remember how that made you feel? Powerless and just awful, right? Well, that's how David feels here. His mouth is dried up like a potsherd. A potsherd is simply just a broken fragment of a clay pot. I mean, it's useless. It's dry. You can't really use it for anything. His tongue sticks to the roof of his mouth, and he says, you lay me in the dust of death. In other words, David is prepared to die. It's not saying that he's thinking he's going to die, because as we'll see later in the psalm, that there's clearly a hope there, an assurance of the Lord's deliverance. But David was prepared either way. He was prepared to go home with his Lord, because at the end of the day, whatever the Lord wills is what will be done. So, David was prepared for that. And then he goes back to talking about the enemies. He says in verse 16, dogs surround me. A pack of villains, like an assembly or even a congregation of villains, encircles him. This congregation is very like-minded, as we saw pictured in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe just a couple minutes ago. They're very like-minded. They all have one purpose, and that is to kill David, right? And he says, they pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. All my bones are on display. This can actually be translated as I can recount all of my feelings, or basically, my life has flashed before my eyes. Now, I don't know if you've ever felt like that, but we can certainly resonate with that. All my bones are on display, like basically at this point of death, as my enemies are circling me, my life is flashing before my eyes. And I can't help but wonder if, maybe he had a lot of regrets, but at the same time, he definitely had a lot of hope and assurance in his Lord. But nevertheless, he says, people stare and gloat over him. So David's misery was the source of people's entertainment. It's terrible. It's terrible. Can't imagine. He says, they divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. Now, I know a lot of what we just talked about is illustrated in the death and crucifixion of Jesus, which we'll get to at a later episode here. But in verse 19, he continues, he says, but you, Lord, Yahweh God, do not be far from me. You are my strength. Come quickly to help me. In other words, David has no strength left He can't do this. He can't overcome his enemies, but the Lord can. The Lord is his strength, and he's pleading to God, come quickly to help me. He says, deliver me from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dogs. Rescue me from the mouth of the lions. Save me from the horns of the wild oxen. He's going back to this imagery here of likening these human enemies or spiritual enemies as dogs, lions, and oxen or bulls, right? So in spite of all of his agony, David, as he's suffering, he continues to trust God and he continues to pray to him. He keeps on praying for deliverance. And I find it really interesting here. So the NIV, as much as I love the NIV, unfortunately, it kind of fails us a bit here. I mean, it says, save me from the horns of the wild oxen. And that's an okay translation. But I wanted to point out to you a lot of the other translations that bring out what I think is a bit more accurate to what the Hebrew language is saying. So if you look up here, we have the NIV translation, and it just says, save me from the horns of the wild oxen. But check out the ESV. It says, you, Yahweh God, have rescued me. NASB, you answer me. NRSV, you have rescued me. The Net Bible, you have answered me. HCSB, you have rescued me from the horns of the wild oxen. And even the New King James Version says, you have answered me. So you see how that is quite different from David just simply saying, save me from the horns of the wild oxen. It's not that. At the time of writing, David is reflecting on how Yahweh God did save him from the enemy. You know, New King James, you have answered me. You have rescued me. That's the sense here. You see, so when we're in times of trouble, times of uncertainty, we feel like our enemies are surrounding us, or even during this, coronavirus quarantine, I know a lot of us don't do well with isolation, but we have no reason to fear. As I'm sure you've often heard by many pastors at this point on social media, we have no reason to fear because we have Jesus. We have the one who, yes, he faced death against those dogs and wild animals and, all of that. He faced death, but he defeated death. That is the hope that we have in suffering, because now that he has defeated death, through faith and trust in him, we can be brought into his promise of eternal life. In other words, we're going to face death someday too. I don't know when, but at some point we're going to face death, but we don't have any reason to fear because we have Jesus who has already conquered death for us. In the same way, David's like, look, I know Yahweh God will rescue me and has rescued me in the past. So we can kind of see in our lives, if we've had any times that we can look back to where Yahweh God, where Jesus remained faithful, proved himself to us, we can lean on those times during our times of uncertainty, because we can know that he will deliver us, whether it's here on this side of eternity, and even if not then, definitely on the other side of eternity. So we're going to continue on in Psalm 22 in future videos, but I hope this provides you with some form of encouragement today, and we'll see you next time.